Welcome back to Halloween House.
So we're continuing with part 3 of our story about Rodney Alcala, the dating game serial killer, who is now back in New York City.
Yeah, and if you missed the first 2 videos, we'll post the links in the description.
Yeah, check those out.
Yes.
So Rodney returned to New York in the summer of 1977, and he's again using that alias John Berger.
Authorities have still not made the connection between Rodney Alcala and John Berger.
And we're going to talk about Ellen Jane Hover. She was 23 years old when she disappeared on July 15th, 1977. And she was reported missing on July 16th.
Now, coincidentally or not, she disappeared one day after the infamous New York City blackout.
And that blackout left the city without electricity for 2 days on July 13th and 14th, and it resulted in widespread looting and arson.
We mentioned this because it's important to note that Rodney Alcala seemed to take advantage of chaotic situations and events.
Yeah, some examples of him inserting himself into opportunistic circumstances are the murder of Cornelia and Ellen, which took place when crime in New York City was at the highest point in history. And at that time, there was also the Son of Sam killer active in the city from July 76 until he was arrested August 10th, 1977.
And a further example of that, and we're going to jump ahead just a little bit, Rodney was in Seattle while a then unknown serial killer was active, and that serial killer would later turn out to be Ted Bundy. Sorry.
He was also back in Los Angeles when committing brutal murders. At the same time, the Hillside Stranglers were active between October 1977 and February 1978.
And bizarrely, coincidentally, he was in fact interviewed by the Hillside Strangler Task Force about a murder committed by the Hillside Stranglers because of his status as a registered sex offender.
And at that point, they had no idea they were actually interviewing a serial killer. Some murders once thought to be committed by the Hillside Stranglers were decades later found to be committed by Rodney Alcala.
Crazy. But like I said, we are jumping up, ahead a bit. We just thought that was interesting. So we're going to get back to Ellen.
Ellen Jane Hover, was born on August 2nd, 1953 in Los Angeles, California. Ellen's father was the owner of the Cyros nightclub in Hollywood.
She grew up in Beverly Hills. She moved to New York City after she graduated from Arcadia University, which is located in Pennsylvania. When she attended, it was known as Beaver College. And she did earn a degree with a major in biology.
And she was trying to figure out what she wanted to do. So she was considering med school. She was also a gifted pianist and was considering the orchestra. And it's something to think about. We had talked before about young women in this era finally breaking free of their parents and getting their own places. And you kind of wonder if this made her a target too.
Yeah. And we're also wondering if it's a coincidence that Rodney was also a gifted pianist. They had that in common.
Yeah. And perhaps this is why she agreed to lunch with a good-looking New York University Fine Arts graduate.
Ellen was very kind and trusting. She considered herself a flower child, even though that era was a decade earlier when she was just a young preteen.
In the media, she was dubbed the nightclub heiress, but her friends and family knew her by the nickname of Flover, which is really cute.
It is. It's a combination of the word flower and her last name, Hover. Flover. That's very cute.
Yeah. 11 months after Ellen went missing, her skeletal remains were found, buried under a pile of rocks at the old Rockefeller estate.
NYPD Missing Person Squad interviewed people who knew Alcala, John Berger, and learned that he often took women to that area to take photographs of them.
She had to be identified through dental records, and when authorities searched her apartment, they found a date book where she wrote, "Lunch with John Berger."
Yeah. On September of 1977, he returns to LA after a meandering road trip across country from New York City.
And you'll want to remember this road trip in our stories because there is another murder tied to him in Wyoming.
And we'll get into his Seattle connection and possible unsolved crimes there.
Seattle's important to remember because this is where his trove of photographs are eventually found.
Now, finally, after how many years, we're getting to how the connection was finally made between Alcala and Berger being the same person.
But unfortunately, it isn't very clear.
It isn't. But somehow the connection was finally made.
Yes. After the LAPD received a call from the FBI pertaining to the disappearance of Ellen Hover and the man she was last seen with, John Berger, the LAPD finally somehow determined that John Berger was an alias used by Rodney Alcala.
On December 14th, 1977, they did bring Alcala in for questioning, but at this point, Ellen's body has not been found yet. So other than the date book entry, there was just nothing to tie him to her.
But along comes the cold case hero. In 2010, this is 2010, Cyrus Vance Jr. became the Manhattan District Attorney.
And he made the opening of cold cases a priority.
Especially Ellen's.
Investigators worked diligently on her case for 2 years.
Despite the fact that by this time, he had already been sentenced to death in California.
And they were able to build a timeline of Alcala's whereabouts. They were, unbelievably, able to find eyewitnesses who saw Alcala with Ellen on the day she disappeared.
It's just amazing. In 2013, almost 4 decades after the murders, Rodney Alcala pled guilty to Ellen and Cornelia's murder.
He was sentenced to 25 years to life.
And was then extradited back to California to spend the remainder of his life on death row.
So this does bring us to a closure on the deaths of Ellen and Cornelia.
There's so much more to tell.
We aren't even halfway through this horrific tale.
In our next segment, as we mentioned earlier, we will talk about the road trip from New York City to Los Angeles and the crimes committed along the way, which, again, unfortunately, would take decades to solve.
Thank you for watching. Stay tuned. Stay spooky.